just said one of those little things in a conversation after a party that had at some friends of ours, where I just talked with her, and she said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Not so good." And she said, "Well, why don't you just see Dr. Duvall for an evaluation? Just see him once." And I did that. And in one session, I felt like this guy really sees what I'm about. And one of the things that he did, he said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want you to answer right away. I want you to answer it as truthfully as you can, because I know the answer."
Welcome to the A Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast, brought to you by the ACO. I'm Dr. Crist Burritt. Each month, we feature a case presentation, interview, or discussion by one or more of our doctors who practice a different kind of psychiatry. We are interested in your questions and comments, and I would love to hear your feedback. Send an email to aco@orgonomy.org. The best way to help the ACO spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. We'd love for you to leave a rating and review about what you enjoy about the podcast, and you can do so either through Apple Podcast, iTunes, or in Amazon's Audible. This helps others know why they too may want to listen. If you're interested in attending one of our webinar presentations, you can meet the doctors and join in on the discussion afterwards. You can connect with us and learn more at orgonomy.org or adifferentkindofpsychiatry.com. This episode features an interview with Peter Crist M.D. He discusses with me how he first learned about Wilhelm Reich and orgonomy as a college biology student, and how through a series of chance encounters and important moments in his life, his path brought him to medical orgone therapy, medical school, training to be a medical orgonomist, and beyond. Well, Dr. Crist, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. I've heard bits and pieces of how you ended up where you are, but I'd like to hear more about how you became a medical orgonomist, how it began, and how you ended up where you are today.
So thank you, Dr. Burritt. I am pleased to be here with you today. And what you say, bits and pieces, as I've thought about it, the story of how I became a medical orgonomist has so many threads to it that I've been thinking about many coincidences, serendipitous occasions, so there's the story about exactly how I became a medical orgonomist, learned about orgonomy, but there's also the backstory about who I was, what I was interested in at the time that I learned about it. So I learned about orgonomy and Reich when I was 16 years old, and I thought about it this morning, December 1965. So if you do the math, that's in December, that'll be 56 years ago. So
wow.
There's a specific moment where that is emblazoned in my mind when I first heard Wilhelm Reich's name and about orgonomy. But before I tell that moment, I think some of the coincidental, serendipitous things that it would be easy to get mystical and call them fate or whatever happened a few months before that. So I want to actually start my story there, and then we can even go back earlier to what I was interested in at the time. But my family moved from Ohio to Oregon the summer of 1965 when I was 15 years old. And I'd been studying languages when I was in high school. And that had been my passionate interest, was to learn and interpret languages. But my high school only had Latin and French as the languages they taught. So my father helped arrange for me to take college languages up at Denison University, where he taught, in Granville, Ohio, where I grew up. And so the high school agreed after my senior year to give me a high school diploma what would have been the end of my senior year if I went ahead and applied as a freshman at Denison. And so there I was going to be going to college after my junior year of high school, and the high school would give me a diploma after 1 year at the college there. So we moved. So that blew that whole plan all apart. So there was no way I was going to get a high school diploma. So there I was left with, am I going to go back to a new high school that I've never been to, or should I try to apply to the college where my father had moved to and was teaching, Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon at the time. So that's what I did. And so I was accepted there. And on freshman orientation, I was walking from the new house we had moved into, which was maybe a half a mile from the college campus. Got down to the end of our street, turned towards the college, and this car pulled up alongside me. And I sort of got a little uncomfortable. Why are they stopping? And they said, "Oh, you're going to freshman orientation?" And ordinarily, I wouldn't have gotten in the car, I don't think, strangers. But I said, yeah. I mean, they seemed friendly. There was a woman driving and a guy in the passenger seat. And so I got in, and they drove me over to freshman orientation, and they looked older than freshmen. And I said, "So are you Lewis and Clark students?" And the woman named Donna said, "Yes, I'm a senior." And the other guy said, "Well, I dropped out of Lewis and Clark last year. I would have been a senior." And I said, "Why are you going to freshman orientation?" They said, "Our good friend Jim Fetty is talking there. They've invited him to speak at freshman orientation." I thought, that's interesting. Let me watch and see who this guy is. And it turns out he was kind of a rebel on campus, and learned that the previous fall, he had run for student body king, walking around campus in a purple jumpsuit, more hair than most people. And at that point, I had almost shoulder length red hair. And so I was kind of one of the ones that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the dress of people with their button down shirts and crew cuts. And over that fall term, I got to know Jim a bit. He was one of the well-known poets on campus in the English department. And then, but you know, I saw him around campus. Then at Christmas time, my sister and I decided to get a job at the post office, and we knew neither of us had a driver's license, so we knew we would be stuck with daytime shifts to take the bus down to the post office unless we could get a ride with somebody. So my sister saw a classmate of hers, David Elliker, over in one of the other lines, and she said, "Well, let me go ask Dave if he's going to be riding down, and then we could carpool with him." And so she went over, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm going with a group," and he pointed, and there was Jim Fetty, Morris, the guy in the car that had stopped to pick me up, and Donna, the woman who had been driving. I said, "This is an amazing coincidence. He's not even a student here." So then I got to know them over, during our lunch breaks at 4 a.m, because we were on the midnight to 8 shift. And Morris was into the macrobiotic diet, and Jim Fetty was a rebel and picked up 5 hamburgers from what he called the local crap burger joint to just sort of stick it to Morris about his strict diet. and then they said, "Well, we've gotten to know you. David's father shot a goose, and we're going to have a macrobiotic Christmas dinner. You and Connie are invited," my sister Connie. And so it was during that dinner that afterwards Morris turned to me and he said, "You're a biology student." And I remember I'm quite sure these are the exact words to this day. "You're a biology student. Did you ever hear of the work of Wilhelm Reich?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, he was a German scientist who discovered a new form of energy that moves in all living things but it doesn't move the way it's supposed to in human beings. And he was put in prison in the Eisenhower administration and died in prison. I said, I never heard of him. And all of those things just absolutely intrigued me because I had gotten discouraged by the biochemical approach to biology. I'd grown up in the woods in Ohio, near the woods, and just watching the birds, tracking animals. To me, that was biology. And so to hear the Krebs cycle taught, I said to myself, this guy's talking about energy, the Krebs cycle of energy, but he's talking about it without any energy. So to hear that there was somebody looking at how energy moves in animals was just intriguing. And at that point, I had turned 16. To a 16-year-old, hearing about someone who was put in prison for his discoveries just grabbed me. So after that dinner, I went down to the Lewis and Clark, the college library, could not find any books by Wilhelm Reich, went to the Portland library, could not find any books by Wilhelm Reich, went to bookstores, did not find anything. And I just sort of put it aside.
And Dr. Crist, if I could interrupt you for a minute, when he said that to you, did you respond to him? Was there any more to it than that?
Well, I know there was, and I'm not sure. I don't remember. I know inside what I found, and I'm pretty sure I said, "Wow, no, I never heard of him." And then the conversation turned to something else, and that's really all that we engaged in at that point. So during that next year, I got to know someone. And we became boyfriend and girlfriend, Gail. And so the following fall, she learned that she had to go back to California because her mother couldn't afford to continue to send her to Lewis and Clark. And so she moved down to San Francisco. She said she was going to go get a job there. And I got more and more discouraged about college. I decided that I was going to drop out. And my father, one of the few times he gave me direct advice, said, my advice to you is finish out this quarter with as good a grades as you can. So if you want to go back, you'll be in a good position to do that. And so I followed his advice, and I dropped out of college in the following December of 66. And Gail wrote to me and said, you come down and visit. I'm living on the panhandle of the Golden Gate Park with a couple of roommates in a big old Victorian house that has been split up into apartments. So I went down and visited her. So this is now February of 1967. I learned that the panhandle of the Golden Gate Park was 2 blocks from Haight Street, 3 blocks from Ashbury Street. I had no idea as an innocent kid from Ohio what Haight-Ashbury meant, but it wasn't long before I would walk out on the porch and listen to the band that had the apartment next door called Country Joe and the Fish. I didn't know who they were, and smelled this smell. I said, that smells like when we used to burn leaves in the fall. And Gail said, you're so innocent, that's marijuana. And so there I was, in Haight-Ashbury in the spring of 67. She decided to apply to San Francisco State in the art department. So I said, okay, I'll go. It's one of my many trips visiting her, and I'll go out to the college with you and just wait while you have your interview. And so I'm standing in the hall of the art building at San Francisco State, looking at the student paintings and drawings on the wall. And I hear this voice behind me. It says, Peter? I said, what? I turned around. It's Morris, the guy who had picked me up for freshman orientation, who had told me about Reich. And he said, what are you doing here? I said, Gail is applying for college here in the art department. He said, wow. He said, did you ever find those books by Reich? I said, no. He said, well, I live a few blocks away. Come over sometime and I'll lend them to you. So maybe in the next week or so, I went and visited him, and he took off the shelf The Murder of Christ by Reich, and he opened it up, and he said, one of the amazing things about this book, he said, look at this, and he showed me it was page after page of references that Reich had used in writing that book. And so I took that book back with me, and on the back porch where I had my sleeping bag at Gail's and her roommate's place, stayed up most of the night with a kerosene lamp reading parts of that book. And it just absolutely grabbed me. And it's like, this guy is talking some sort of truth that I've never heard anybody write about before, talking about how people suffer personally, but also the social implications of that. And so I went back and visited Morris again. He said, I said, I want to give you the book back. I haven't finished it yet. He said, well, go down to City Lights bookstore. They have lots of Reich's books. And City Lights bookstore was the bookstore founded by the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And there were all of these books by Reich. I could only afford to buy a couple of them. One was The Murder of Christ. The other was Listen, Little Man. And I also bought The Function of the Orgasm. And those then became the beginning of my education about Reich. So,
Dr. Crist, you mentioned that Morris had emphasized the references in The Murder of Christ. What was he getting at there?
What he was getting at was, this is not just some guy giving opinions out of nowhere. He did tremendous research about Christ and the history and the background of the ideas that he was putting forward in that book. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that really struck me.
Yeah.
And so the other part of the story, to take a few steps back, so I was interested in biology, so I applied to the biology. Well, when I filled out my application for Lewis and Clark College, they asked, what major, and I really didn't know, except I knew I loved science and biology. So I put that down, and they asked, where do you see you going in your life? What do you think you're going to do? And I couldn't remember for a long time, but years later, I asked my father if he could go in the archives at Lewis and Clark after he'd retired and did a copy of that application. And he sent me a copy, and there in my shaky 15-year-old cursive writing, I had written that there were three things that I thought that I wanted to do in some way to help people, either be a teacher, a social worker, or a psychiatrist. So that was before I'd ever heard of orgonomy and Reich. So that was already in me. And even in high school, I used to walk down to the college campus at night when the medical student club showed movies, and I was intrigued by watching the movies about surgery. And I'll never forget the one of a knee surgery and a thyroid surgery. And so there was something about medicine and helping people in a medical way that was already in me. And through my own therapy, I sort of uncovered some of what that story was about, which we can go into some. But
you mean therapy later on, not during that time of your life?
Yes, that's right. Therapy later on.
You mentioned being intrigued by the surgery and having an interest in maybe being a social worker, a teacher, a psychiatrist. And I think you said your father was a professor?
My father was a professor. Yes, he was a professor of in the sociology department. His specialty was family life and sex education. And I laugh because for many years I was not interested in marital therapy, that kind of thing, because I knew my father's approach to family life was really kind of messed up. So the irony is, when I look back, I followed very much in his footsteps, but did not want to think of myself as following in his footsteps, although I have no doubt he influenced me tremendously. But he was one of those people who was a liberal, trying to we would have family meetings at home that was supposedly democratic. I knew they weren't democratic. He would usually get his way. In fact, one of my memoir stories that I think I read at the college talked about that. But there's no question in my mind that his background very much affected me.
Did you have any understanding of psychiatrists at that point, or of what they did or how they worked, or did you know anybody?
I didn't know any psychiatrists, but my father had been trained in psychotherapy. In fact, when I was in kindergarten, he took a year away from Denison in Ohio, and we spent a year in Topeka, Kansas, where he studied at the Menninger Clinic, studying psychotherapy, family therapy. And I know during that period, I mean, I was only a 5-year-old in kindergarten, so I know during that period I met psychiatrists. I know that was just sort of part of the milieu. But where I was growing up in Granville, I didn't know any psychiatrists particularly. So where to take this from here? Let me pick up the story. I think with reading Reich's books, conversations with Morris in San Francisco, he told me how he had learned about orgonomy and Reich himself, and it was from Sandy Goodman in Ashland, Oregon. So Morris had grown up in Southern Oregon, Roseburg, Oregon, and so on some visit home, he had happened to go to some art presentation in Ashland, Oregon. And Sandy Goodman was a sculptor, an artist who had been around the orgonomy crowd in New York. And in fact, he had married the daughter of Simeon Trop, who is one of the orgonomists that Reich had trained. And so he moved to Ashland, Oregon, I think to find a place that would be safe from nuclear fallout. So this was in the early mid 60s when that was a concern. And he then, as an artist, started doing self-expression classes. His wife Sylvia was a dance therapist. So I had heard about that, and Morris said, "You got to go visit Sandy." And so I did, and again, I still didn't have a driver's license. These were the days that I was hitchhiking between Portland, Oregon, where my family lived, and San Francisco, where Gail was living. And so Ashland was sort of halfway in between on the route. And one time I wrote to Sandy Goodman and I said, "I heard about you from Morris. I wondered if I could stop and visit." So Sandy took a very intense. I'm not quite. It's not quite liking to me, but looking back, he was actually quite seductive in the way that he's treated me like I was special, and allowed me to stay there when he had these other students coming up that didn't stay there. And even on one of my visits with him, he said, "Well, I think you're going to do big things in orgonomy." And the modest Quaker part of me said, "No." I could not tolerate having anybody say something positive, so I sort of dismissed it. But I also felt that he wasn't genuine about it, that he was trying to use it to connect with me for something for himself. And so what happened from there, I learned much more about Reich and orgonomy just talking with Sandy and Sylvia. I went to some of their self-expression classes on my visits, and then Sandy had a long class, what he called a long class, a whole weekend session. And this was at the time where I was applying as a Quaker conscientious objector with the draft board.
Mm-hmm.
And the experience I'd had with the draft board was just awful for me. I mean, I'm by nature, I think, a very sensitive person, and they were so contemptuous of me. And so in that long class, Sandy invited me to say, was there anything that had come up lately with me? And I told him that. And so he played the part of the draft board members and was able to provoke a rage in me that I had never felt in my life. And so I raged at him. Then I went home to Portland and became severely sick with a sore throat. And I think probably a strep throat with fevers of 102, 103. But I had decided I was going to cure myself with the macrobiotic diet. I wouldn't let my parents take me to a doctor. But I then somehow said, just decided I'm going to just eat what I want. And I actually got better rather than worse, which I had been doing. And at that point, I said, Sandy Goodman had no idea what he was doing. He had powerful knowledge, but totally used it to create something I felt for his own ego. So once I got better, I decided I was going to move back down to San Francisco. I had again gotten to know Morris better. Morris had started dancing, and he had had sort of a free expression dance event one time in his apartment with me and his girlfriend. And he said, well, you ought to join our dance troupe. Well, again, I'm just sort of hitchhiking back and forth between San Francisco and Portland doing odd jobs. But once I got better, I decided to move back down and see what might happen in San Francisco. I didn't know where I was going to go for sure, and learned that Morris had left San Francisco. This was the days before cell phones. I didn't even call. I didn't write. I'm just going to go to San Francisco and see what happens.
Yeah.
So learned that he had left San Francisco, moved to LA to get into orgone therapy. And one of the people from the long class lived in Sausalito outside of San Francisco. So I had a connection with her. I visited her as I was trying to sort out what I wanted to do, and decided, no, I'm going to stay in San Francisco. I'll get a job. I'll go hitchhike down to San Francisco, visit. At that point, I remember that one of Morris's old girlfriends owned some properties. I called her up and I said, do you know anybody that might have a room to rent? She said, oh, I have a room to rent. So I moved into her apartment, and she also was aware of orgonomy. At that point, her boyfriend was a fellow named Ben Benjamin, who had moved out from New York and was very actively involved. There was sort of a whole orgone therapy crowd, both in San Francisco, and then many of them moved down to LA. And so I got a job at the Bank of America, working mail delivery midnight to 8, and earned enough money that I decided I would see about going down to orgone therapy with Dr. Stoll in California, near Los Angeles, which was the person that Morris had gone down to see. And it turns out a bunch of people from Ashland and from the San Francisco area had done that. So I continued doing that up until that summer, when I realized I need to move down to LA so I can continue in therapy more regularly. So that was the beginning of my being in therapy. And meanwhile, I'd been reading the books by Reich, and I knew somewhere in me, this is the work that I want to do. But, I was still 17 years old at the time. I hadn't gone back to school yet. And so for that first summer in LA, I got a job in the Forest Service fighting brush fires in the Angeles National Forest and commuting. That was within an hour drive of where Dr. Stoll's office was. So we'd go down for therapy once a week with her fighting brush fires. And that summer was enough to convince me I don't want to be packing 50-pound hose packs up the mountain fighting brush fires. I'm going to go back to college. So that's when I went back to school at San Fernando Valley State. And at that point, I knew I was interested in pre-med. I went into the zoology department at that point as a zoology major. And eventually decided to move over to the Santa Monica area near UCLA, and I transferred to UCLA. And in my therapy, as I said, I had it in the back of my mind that I might want to be a medical orgonomist. But the way I was looking at it was, I don't know if I would qualify. So, whatever you want to call that, good sense, modesty, whatever. And so I said, I need to just follow this step by step. And my therapy with Dr. Stoll was very helpful in mobilizing my anger, my aggression. But there was something that just was missing, and I don't think I knew it quite clearly at the time. But I started to apply to medical school, and she said, "Well, I think you're really doing well. I think we should cut back on the sessions." And I started to get anxious, or not quite anxious, but just unsure of what I wanted to be doing. I was working lab assistant jobs at UCLA that I'd been doing when I was before I graduated from there as an undergraduate, and I got more and more sort of uncertain about what I wanted to do. I actually set up 3 interviews to apply to the 3 medical schools in Southern California. UC Irvine, that was a new one, UCLA, and USC. And the long and short of it, I bounced the application check for my first application with UC Irvine. I came late to my interview at USC. And I said to myself, my unconscious is making a decision. I'm not ready to do this. And I said, I need to just put that aside. I don't know what it is that I want to do. I was involved with another girlfriend, Nancy, and she had been in therapy but had decided to leave therapy, move back to Washington. And I was really struggling with what I wanted to do. And at that point, Dr. Stoll said, "Well, I think you're finished with therapy. We should stop." And it's only in recent years that I've been able to look back and realize what happened. I got more and more depressed to the point that I was thinking about leaving LA. Maybe I would move up to Seattle area, somehow with the hopes maybe I'd get back together with Nancy if she moved up there. But I was just really kind of lost. And I even set up an appointment with Michael Rothenberg, who was an orgonomist that had trained with Baker and was in Seattle, to talk with him about the possibility of seeing him. But I got back to LA, and the sister of the person that I mentioned in Sausalito, named Debbie Cohen, who's still around, involved with the college, was one of that group that had moved down to LA. She had stopped seeing Dr. Stoll and had started seeing Dr. Duvall. And she just said one of those little things in a conversation after a party that had some friends of ours, where I just talked with her, and she said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Not so good." And she said, "Well, why don't you just see Dr. Duvall for an evaluation? Just see him once." And I did that. And in one session, I felt like this guy really sees what I'm about. And one of the things that he did, he said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want you to answer right away. I want you to answer it as truthfully as you can, because I know the answer." And he said, "Are you suicidal?" And I started to cry. And I said, "Yes." I'd not realized it, but as soon as he asked that, and he said, "Do you have any guns?" I said, "Yes, I've learned some target practice." He said, "Bring them in." And so he took my guns, and he was able, within 3 sessions, to help mobilize my anger and depression. And I came out of it really within a month. And I said, in my mind, I think Dr. Duvall saved my life.
Wow.
And at that point, I had no question that I had to pursue this much more deeply. And what I started to say a few minutes ago, looking back, what I now realize is when Dr. Stoll said, "I think you're done with therapy," in my mind, that meant I'm healthy. And somewhere deep in me, I said, if this is health, I don't want to live like this, because I just still was not able to access my deeper feelings. And, at the time, I didn't know. I was just struggling and thrashing around. And so at that point, I applied and for another job. I knew, okay, I need to get a job so that I can really continue in therapy with Dr. Duvall. And so I got a job at the Wadsworth VA Hospital as the chief technician of the pulmonary function lab. And within, so I was doing spirometry, breathing tests with patients at the VA. I was supervising the people in the gas lab, measuring the oxygen levels. And within, I don't know, probably it was only just the first 2 days, I said, "I'm working with patients. I love this." I said, "I don't know whether I can ever be an orgonomist, but I would love to be a doctor." And so at that point, it was now into the fall. I started looking. Almost all the applications were closed. There was one school in California, UC Davis, that still had open applications. I applied. They invited me for an interview. They said, we're full, but if something opens up, we could accept you." And in 2 weeks, I heard that they had a spot. And so I started medical school at that point up in UC Davis. So, that's a hike from LA. But, at that point, there was no doubt in my mind that I wanted to be a medical ergonomist if I could. And if not, I would be an internist, is what I envisioned, even though, looking at my interest in surgery, I think if I'd never heard about orgonomy, I might well have become a surgeon. I don't know. Which which reminds me, interrupt me if there's more that you.
I don't want to.
You don't want to, but I just remembered. I'm getting a step ahead of the story. once I finished medical school, I decided to come east to train with the college. And at that point, it meant training with Dr. Baker. But it also meant I knew that Robert Dew had trained as an internist as his traditional approach before he became an orgonomist. So in my medical well, I'm taking a detour back. In my medical school rotations, my advisor in psychiatry was nicknamed Dr. Sunshine. He was this absolute California nut, no sense whatsoever to me. I felt like I learned far more from the schizophrenic patients out at the Sepulveda VA hospital that I evaluated and worked with than I learned from him. I loved my surgery rotations, but I said I want more patient contact. I loved internal medicine, the discipline of diagnosis, and so at that point I decided that I would apply for a residency in internal medicine, and thought, well, if Dr. Dew can become an orgonomist from being an internist, maybe that's a pathway that I could follow. So I set up electives in New York City to interview at various hospitals. And by that time, the NYU course about Reich and orgonomy was going on. And Dr. Dew was giving one of those talks during that month that I was there. So I went down to listen to his talk, and I had written him earlier and said, I'd like to just talk with you about your path becoming an orgonomist. So we went out to dinner afterwards, and I talked with him about that. And so I did match for the internal medicine program at St. Vincent's in New York City. So I knew I was going to be coming to New York, and tried to arrange my sessions with Dr. Baker whenever I could manage it in my schedule. And I think the first time I was there, I had met Dr. Baker when I came back for those interviews, when I did the electives. I said, I'm interested in therapy with you. I'm interested in training. And so if I'm in New York, would you see me? And so I saw him for a couple sessions during that month I was there as a...
So you stopped therapy with Dr. Duvall?
Well, I had continued therapy with Dr. Duvall up through when I left LA to move to New York for my internship. So good question. Yeah, there's some things about that I think are important about my path in becoming an ergonomist. I'll go back to them, but a minute ago, what I remembered was the story with Dr. Baker. The first time I saw him after I'd started my internship at St. Vincent's, he said, not many people know this, and he had that droll way of talking. And he said, I was going to go to St. Vincent's when I came out of medical school. He said, I was in New York, I was uptown, and I had applied to a residency in surgery at St. Vincent's. And I said, really? He said, yeah. And halfway down 7th Avenue, I had terrible abdominal pains, and I knew I had developed acute appendicitis. I asked the cab driver to take me to the nearest hospital, which happened to be Bellevue. I had appendicitis. They did an appendectomy, and I was just too embarrassed to ever call St. Vincent's again to reschedule the interview. And he said, so I looked around, all of the surgery residencies were filled, and I looked to see, was there anything else that was available? And there was an opening in psychiatry at Greystone Hospital in New Jersey. So I applied and I got in there, and the rest is history. This was by way of him saying how he became a medical ergonomist was by accident becoming a psychiatrist, where he then got a job, at Marlborough State Hospital, where he then heard about Reich, and the rest is history. But you know, so I don't know if that story is ever documented anywhere. But it's one of those. It was one of those moments where it was like he was saying, "Yeah, you and I have something we share." St. Vincent's. Um, so, where to take this story from here? Because you had asked if I had stopped therapy with Dr. Duvall,
Yes.
and what happened with Dr. Duvall was, again, what I've subsequently learned in looking at myself in therapy much later was I have been driven very much by my unconscious mind making decisions for me, seemingly making decisions for me that I was not consciously making. And I think that happens with many people, but for some reason with me, many of those unconscious reactions have been the very best thing, the very best decisions I could have made. And what happened with Dr. Duvall is he knew I was interested in um, uh, training as a medical ergonomist, and he invited me to sit in on sessions with him. When I was in medical school at UC Davis, I commuted down a classmate of mine had a girlfriend in Los Angeles, so we would come down for weekends, and I would have a session with Dr. Duvall, and I didn't talk with my classmate about that, but I would go down for therapy, and then Dr. Duvall allowed me in my sophomore year of medical school to sit in on some sessions. And then I transferred down to UCLA to finish my medical school. And then I could see Dr. Duvall much more regularly. His office was literally a 5-minute walk from the UCLA campus. And so I was continuing therapy, but I felt and knew he had high hopes for me as a medical ergonomist. And he didn't say anything to me at the time, but I could feel it, and I felt it as a pressure that I wasn't ready, and a burden that I just knew I wasn't ready to take on. I needed to take things step at a time. And so when I applied to go back east to do my residency in New York City and train with Duvall, he took it as a somewhat of a betrayal, I think. And then it all came out in the open in my sessions, and that he felt I was running away from a certain depth that we were getting to in my therapy with him. And I think he was right about that. But what he wasn't right about was that I wasn't ready to really be solidly on the track of being a medical ergonomist yet. I needed to just take my own time, and subsequently, when I after I'd been in New York for a year, I went back out to LA and visited him, spent a week, had again some therapy with him, and sat in on sessions with him for that week. And during that week, we really cleared the air about my feeling that he had high hopes for me. He said, "Well, I didn't want to put pressure on you, so I didn't say anything." I said, "I'm the opposite. I can feel all those things. If I hear the truth explicitly, I can deal with it much better." And so I think we really worked through that. And so then I was much more free to just continue my therapy with Dr. Baker But I did move back out to LA after my second year of medical residency with the hope at that point of training with Duval and, in a sense, taking over his practice. And unfortunately, within 3 months of me getting back out there, he developed cancer and had died within 3 months. So there I was back in LA finishing my medical residency, trying to decide what to do. So I moved back to New York to continue my training and therapy with Dr. Baker. And I don't know how many of our listeners know some of the story, but there was a falling out between Dr. Baker and his son Courtney, who Dr. Baker had hoped would take over much of the training. And so Courtney and a group of other orgonomists left the college. And at that point, Dr. Baker, I was at that point was in my last year of psychiatric residency. So I'd come back east to do a psychiatry residency, and as well as train with Baker. And so when those people left, that included Dr. Dew, who had taught the didactic course to me and was the one who continued teaching the didactic course through that whole period. And Dr. Baker said, we need somebody to, he said, what are you interested in doing in terms of orgonomy? I said, continuing to train as an orgonomist. And he said, what else in terms of the work of the college? I said, well, I started doing some work proofreading the journal. I'd like to continue that. And he said, well, you're a chief resident in your psychiatry residency. You told me you like to teach. I said, yeah, I do. Just sort of getting my feet wet with that. And he said, how about teaching the didactic course? I said, I'm not even done with my residency, and I haven't practiced as a medical ergonomist. And he said, you know the theory, don't you? I said, yes. So that was when I then started teaching the didactic course, which I've continued in that role, to the most recent course we had. And it was Dr. Baker knew me well enough to know at that moment the way he asked me was not going to be feeding my ego the way whatever was happening with Dr. Duval started to do. And I think that the bottom line was that Dr. Baker really, he just kept it so simple. You know the theory, don't you? So like you don't have to be any great expert at orgonomy to teach the didactic course. Yeah.
It sounds like he really had a way with words.
Oh, he did. Yes. Many people have described his words like a single word, like a knife that would just cut right through.
Yeah.
So I actually started supervision with some of the orgonomists before I had finished my residency. So I had supervision meetings with Louisa Lance, who was Courtney Baker's wife at the time, and some with Michael Gantz, just going over my residency psychotherapy cases. And to me, that was a tremendously valuable thing, was to just work purely character analytically before having anybody on the couch. And so then once I finished my residency, I set up my own office. I didn't want the pressure of having to make my living with my private practice. So I continued teaching at Robert Wood Johnson, which is where I did my psych residency. And I was there 60% time as my practice built. And then I took on a couple of orgone therapy patients. And at that point, in my mind, everybody would be seen on the couch, undressed and down to comfortable clothes to work with them. And there was something about that. The first, I can't even quite remember which page. I have two patients that I saw that were the first orgone therapy patients that came wanting orgone therapy by that name. And there was something about just understanding their character and being able to look at their body and see where they were holding back the emotions. That one was a fellow, I know his basic problem was paranoia, who was very mistrustful, but he just held himself so rigid that just having him lie down, he relaxed, and we were able to actually address his mistrust that he had glossed over when we were sitting up talking before that. And another was a woman, very emotional, very intense. I think I wrote up her case at some point in I can't remember the title, but dramatic reactions that come up in therapy, where she had visual blindness as a way of not, because she couldn't tolerate seeing things. So the connection between the body and the emotions and the character is just such a core part of medical orgone therapy that it, from my own experience in therapy, it just made sense and worked.
Dr. Crist, you mentioned when you first read The Murder of Christ, not just an individual suffering, but the way it affects the social realm. Was there any work that you were doing in your residency in your early time as a medical ergonomist in the social realm?
In my residency, my training in group therapy and family therapy, working in that social realm, somehow never quite clicked for me. I was interested in it, and I mentioned about my father. In retrospect, I'm quite certain I was terribly skeptical of family therapy because that's what he did, and he divorced my mother after they'd been married 40 years. The tension when she had chronic renal failure, when she went on dialysis at home, there was something about the tension of that just got terribly in the way of their relationship. So he and I had sort of a difficult patch that we went through, but we came to a rapprochement, and I visited him, and I will never forget him saying, when you and your mother and I were going through difficult times, I decided to go into therapy. And this was like his confession that he had serious enough problems that he actually asked for help, and he said it with that sort of wry smile that he could have. And he said, yeah, the first session I went to the therapist, I described all the things going on in our family, and he said, the therapist told me, you're not telling me anything I haven't heard before, but just not all in one family. So that was my father's way of saying, okay, I acknowledge I may have been an expert in family life, but I didn't know how to do it in reality. And that was a major step, I think, both for him and our relationship, but for me, being able to let go of my negative thoughts about family and marital therapy. But I did come back to working in that area, and how that happened was Marty Goldberg contacted the college to ask if there was someone who would be an advisor on his master's thesis, because he wanted to look at the character of organizations. And he thought that Reich's ideas about character were applicable in the organizational realm. So I started working with him, and we worked very closely, and I got steeped in group process, organizational thinking, and realized in any time that I had attempted to do uh, marital therapy, it just, I mean, anytime I'd attempted to work with children, I needed to work with the parents, but that's where I was struggling, was how to do that. And then it dawned on me that the parental relationship is a love relationship of the mates, but it's a working relationship in raising children. And somehow I started applying the work relationship knowledge that I was learning and working with Marty Goldberg to looking at families. And in fact, that was the basis of the paper that I wrote, the biosocial basis of couples and family therapy, that's in the journal. And from there, some other people learned that I was interested in organizations, and someone asked me if I would help with a company that they had invested in. And so one thing and another, I went from applying that to families to actually working. And so about a quarter of my practice now, I would call it purely social orgonomy, working as a functional business consultant with organizations. So there we are. The three things at age 15, I said I might want to be a teacher, a social worker, or a psychiatrist. And I've somehow ended up doing some aspect of all three of those.
All three.
And looking back, my father politically was liberal, but I looked at Baker's book, Man in the Trap, very early on when I had gone back to college. It was in the library, and his chapter on the sociopolitical character types, he talks about the liberal rebels against their father, the conservative competes with their father. And my parents had become Quakers. Competition just really was not acceptable. One of the consequences of which my siblings and I are some of the most competitive siblings I've ever run into. We did equal. The competition is going to come out in one form or another. But I've thought back, and how do you rebel against someone who's seemingly so open-minded as my father, and saying, well, we need to look at all sides and so forth. And I realized I didn't really ever rebel against him. I competed against him. He was originally trained as a chiropractor before he decided to leave that and become a professor and sociologist. So instead of a chiropractor, I became a medical doctor. Instead of a marital therapist, I became a social orgonomist. And instead of teaching at a university, I competed with finding my own creative ways to teach at the college.
And not only that, but you're president of the American College of Orgonomy.
Yes. That's a whole other story that I'm not sure we should go into, but there's one other thread in my story that I think I want to mention, and that's the personal thread that, again, the unconscious mind is an amazing thing. I ended up marrying the second girlfriend that I mentioned, Nancy, and we had one daughter. We have one daughter who is now in her mid-30s. And that marriage started to really run into serious trouble when my daughter was about a year to 18 months old. And we separated at that point. And I wrote a poem about seeing my daughter's face when I came over to visit, her excitement, but also her anxiety. And in that poem, I said something like, is it me at 3 afraid I won't see my mother again, or is it you? And I, all of us, it was more explicit. Afraid my mother would die, I think was the line in the poem. And all of a sudden I said, where the heck did that come from? You know, and I called my father and asked I knew that my mother had been sick when my brother was born when I was 3, that she had been in the hospital. But I had never consciously had any thought about how ill she was. Um, and so I called him and he said, oh, yeah, it was hour to hour. We didn't know whether she was going to live or not. And so that says a lot about him and our whole family, that just things were not talked about. When I look back, here he was in his late 30s with 4 children, ranging in age from 8 to a 1-month-old infant. What the hell he must have been going through at that time. And there I am at 3 years old, not knowing what was going to happen and not being able to talk with him. And, so I've looked at this.
Feeling it.
Yeah, but feeling it. And so that was deep in my unconscious that my mother almost died when I was 3. And I think that one simple fact set a particular quality to my whole character, that I just have responded stoically. And I mean, I even mentioned it in terms of the pandemic, that my response tends to be stoic, but I'll just take on the burden of taking care of everybody else. And I think that was a significant driving force in me wanting to help people, wanting to take care of people. I knew, my mother went on dialysis when I was in my 2nd year of medical school. So I had no illusions that she had significant medical problems, but the depth of where that came from in me is one of those pieces that, it had been kept so unconscious and then broke through before I could even begin to deal with it in therapy. It broke through in a poem, of all things.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Crist, this has been a wonderful story that you've been sharing with me and the audience. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, thinking about the story I've told, there are actually a couple of crucial things that I want to be sure that I mention. And you mentioned a while ago that I had become president of the American College of Orgonomy. And thinking back, that year that I was first elected, which was October of 1991, believe it or not, was 1 month before I met my wife, Hillary. I mean, obviously, she wasn't my wife at that point, but we met 1 month after I was elected president. At that point, I had custody of my 5-year-old daughter, Tara. And that year then became a whirlwind year. So we were married in June of the following June, 1992. And so right at the point that I became president of the college, I was in a new love relationship. And when I mentioned to you that I had started working with the parents of children as working relationships, I could never really do marital therapy, even though I had tried other than working on the work relationship between parents, until I was in a happy marriage. So once I met Hillary, that's when I could really work with couples in an effective way. So that was the beginning of her having a profound effect on my development as a medical orgonomist. But she's also just been an incredible support. The next annual dinner where I was elected again, she organized that. She had been involved with planning, and she's just been an incredible support. She's also my first editor of all of my writing. So my writing stories that I've been working on. She's been an incredible support. So in so many ways, I could not be the medical ergonomist I am today if it hadn't been for my relationship with her, her support, and her ongoing support with all kinds of things with the college. And the other key person that I realized that I just haven't mentioned is Dr. Konya, who's had a profound effect on me. I first met him when I came back east and started training with the college. So that would have been in 1978. I started in the clinical seminars, and so he was one of the leaders of the clinical seminars. And then when Dr. Baker died in 1985, I switched to Dr. Konya as my personal therapist and training therapist. So he's had a profound effect on me. And I have the privilege, I feel like, of having worked with three wonderful special medical ergonomists, Dr. Duval, Dr. Baker, and Dr. Konya, all of whom are incredibly different in terms of their personalities and characters, but each one effective in their own way. And he's also been an incredible colleague in the college. And I've been president, he's been vice president since the very beginning. And that doesn't even do justice to the role he's played in my training, in my own personal emotional development. Some people have said, if I am president, I've been the head of the college, he is the heart of the college, just that part that keeps the energy moving from the chest. So. And there's one other thing that strikes me, and that was, I mentioned The Murder of Crist as the first book of Reich's that I read that really had an impact. And I haven't mentioned it yet. I've mentioned it elsewhere, but there's
some. You were 15 or 16 at the time?
I was at the time. I was 17 at the time that I first found that book. So I first heard about orgonomy from Morris when I was 16, but it wasn't until I was 17 that I actually found any of the books and borrowed that one from Morris. So, but there is a line in that book that's for some reason just really stuck with me. And I will reflect back of the impact that it had. But the line that stuck with me is "Armored man rushes to the fuck." And I, at that point, was very shy, particularly about girls. And I had been around jocks and other guys who were womanizers. And I know just in my heart, I felt like, God, if I've got to be like that, I'm never going to have a girlfriend. And there was something about simultaneously reading Reich saying "armored man rushes to the fuck" and then having a chapter that he called the genital embrace, where he really distinguishes neurotic, messed up sexuality with armored man rushing to the fuck from healthy, sweet, emotionally connected sexuality in a chapter called the genital embrace. And looking back, I am very fortunate that I read that before I was ever sexually active. I think reading it just made me realize I don't have to be like all these other guys to have some sort of healthy love and sexual relationship. And it's one of those things, sometimes just one phrase or one bit in Reich's writing just captures somebody. And I think that contrast was what really captured me.
Yeah. If more 17-year-olds could hear that now.
I know, that's what I keep thinking. God, how lucky I was. And, young people, I know you work with a lot of young people, and what they're dealing with now with sexuality, I think is far more messed up and complicated than when I was that age.
Yeah, even my own, I think so.
Yeah.
It's been very moving to hear your story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with me and the audience.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's I wouldn't be here where I am now if it weren't for having learned about Reich and orgonomy when I was 16 years old. I mean, I have no question about that. It so profoundly affected not just my personal life, but my work life. So when Reich talked about love, work, and knowledge, it deeply affected every aspect of those three in me.
Yeah. And is Maura still alive?
Oh yes. Talking about more serendipity, coincidence, fate, whatever you want to call it. We sort of drifted apart, and in February 2011, I got a letter from him saying, it's been an act of courage for you to keep me on your Christmas card list for the last 10 years with no response. And I wanted to let you know that I had a heart attack a couple of months ago, and it's brought me into contact with looking at who are the people that have mattered in my life. And so I tried to find his phone number. He wasn't listed, but I paid some money to do an online search, got his phone number, called him up because I didn't want to just write back after that letter. And he was astounded that I had done the sleuthing to get his number and I'd actually gotten it. But and so on the phone, part of our conversation was, so what are you doing? And I said, well, I started writing memoir stories about that started with my time at St. Vincent's and have expanded into other parts of my life. And I said, the irony is a month ago, I wrote this story about how I first met you when you picked me up driving to freshman orientation. He said, well, I'd love to see it. And the long and short of it is he and I now, he became what we called my cardiac critic, telling me whether my heart was in the stories. So he had been working on a novel at that point and knows a tremendous about writing. And so he and I have worked on my writing together. And we have even though I've just not found time since the pandemic to do much writing on that, he and I still have a once a week online meeting where we just catch up on things. So.
Well, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. You just never know. And as I said, you could get mystical about it, about fate or whatever. But
right.
There's just been so many little things like that.
Again, this has been a special treat, and I thank you very much for sharing it with me and the listeners.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
How do you feel after listening to this story? What do you think? I'm fortunate to call Dr. Crist a mentor and colleague of mine, and as I said, I was moved to hear about his journey, and it reminded me that many of us first learned about orgonomy and medical orgone therapy as adolescents or young adults. Perhaps some will hear this podcast and consider reading for themselves The Murder of Christ, The Function of the Orgasm, or even one of Dr. Crist's wonderful articles for the Journal of Orgonomy on our website. We are interested in your questions and comments, and I would love to hear your feedback. Send an email to aco@orgonomy.org. Stay tuned for our next episode, and we'd love to have you join us for one of our webinars. The best way to help the ACO spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. I hope you share this podcast with your friends and family and let them know about our work. You can connect with us at orgonomy.org or adifferentkindofpsychiatry.com. I'm Dr. Crist Burritt. Thank you for listening to the A Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast with the ACO. Since 1968, the psychiatrists affiliated with the American College of Orgonomy have been helping patients discover greater satisfaction, health, and overall well-being in their lives, whether patients suffer with mental illness, struggle with addiction, or feel unsatisfied with their work lives or relationships. Medical orgone therapy, as practiced by the physicians at the ACO, offers a way forward, often without the use of medication.